Hello there, 7th graders. This is Mrs. Minowitz, and I am here today to talk to you about some of the vocabulary that we are going to be using in our new unit on evolution. And the word that I would like to start with is the word evolution. So evolution is the process by which populations accumulate inherited changes over time. Whoa, that's a lot of words and a lot of things that are getting said there. What I really want us to focus on is that we are looking at how populations change over time. And we are looking at things that they could inherit or pass on, not necessarily things that are environmentally influenced. We're looking at things that you could inherit from your parents. And we are again focusing on populations here, not on individuals. So we're not looking at how like a person or a frog or a bird changes throughout their life. We are looking at how a whole group or population changes. Word that or term that you are going to hear frequently is what is called natural selection. Natural selection is how evolution happens. It's the process of evolution. And natural selection is a process where organisms that have favorable traits, things that help them survive and reproduce, they're going to do better than things that don't have favorable traits. So over time, we're going to start to see that what's called a favorable trait in the population. So this is a lot of words, and I kind of want to give you an example to go with that. And we're going to look at this picture here that shows you kind of this idea of natural selection. So we have some birds and some beetles, and the beetles are two different colors, this kind of this brownish orange here, and then there's also the green ones. And we have our birds here, and they say, yum, green beetles are favorite. So they want to eat the green beetles. And so over time, the green beetles get eaten more. It's not very favorable to be green because the birds like them. So over time, we start to see less and less of the green beetles. And that would make sense because those that have it, that trait, aren't able to survive and reproduce, so it doesn't get passed along. And then we end up with not having green beetles. We only have these orangish brown ones because the green ones were eaten more frequently. Notice here, again, we're comparing a population of the beetles over time, not an individual one. It's not like one of them says, hey, it'd be better if I was a different color, I'm going to change color. It's not how this works. We're focusing again on the individual, or I'm sorry, on the population and not the individual. In order to really understand this concept, there's some terms that you're going to have to be familiar with, so I want to go through those. And the first term is what is called variation. So variation is the variety between individuals of the same species. So even if something is the same species, it's not exactly the same. So one example would be here with horses. So all of these pictured here are horses, but they're not all the same size. They are not all the same color. They do not all have the same body structure. Some are more or less muscular builds as a breed type. So variation is just how they are different. Okay, so everything is not exactly the same, even if something is the same species. You could also think about this with like dogs. Dogs are the same species, but they do not all look alike. They can be very different in their characteristics. That is called variation. Other examples here might be flowers being different colors, having different sizes or shapes. Birds, again, having different colors, sizes, or shapes. Different colored dots, different size legs, different size wings. All of these things are variation. Another term that we're going to hear a lot of is this idea of an adaptation. So adaptations are characteristics that to help an organism survive in its environment. And shown here I have some adaptations of the American beaver. So American beavers like to also be in water as well as on land, and they do spend they use their teeth for a lot of different things. So it's really important that they have these adaptations, these long, sharp incisors, these are a type of teeth, that they never stop growing, which means that they can still use them. They don't get too worn down. They have nostrils and ears that close so that they can go underwater so they don't have to worry about that and having water getting left behind. They have webbed feet that also have claws here that let them move both on land and also help them to swim in water by having that webbing. So adaptation is just something that helps it survive. For a beaver, it could be the type of teeth it has. It could be having webbed feet. It could be the special things about its nostrils and ears. Other organisms have different adaptations. And we'll discuss more examples of that in class as well. Diversification is the variety that exists among groups of living things. So diversification, for example, is, hey, if we start off with one species of butterfly and over time, now we have a whole bunch of different types of butterflies. They all look very different. And those differences between them is the variation. But when we're talking about, hey, this group came, we had one of them and now we have like 80 different types, that is diversification. So butterflies would be an example of that, the many different types. Speciation is when a single species eventually becomes two separate species. This gives us that diversity and diversification. And this can happen when things are separated or isolated from each other. So for example, there are two squirrels here, two species of squirrels that live on different sides of the Grand Canyon. They were isolated or just kept separate from each other because of the Grand Canyon, and over time those populations changed so that they're slightly different. Okay? And they're now different species. Same thing over here with this idea of the salamanders. They live in different areas and have different traits here, and over time they became different species because they became so different. One other thing that I want to discuss is the evidence for evolution, or this process, this idea that our populations can change over time. So there's three things that we can look at. They are fossils, what are called vestigial structures, and also what are called homologous structures. And we're going to talk about each one here in more detail. So if you're following along on the note sheet, we'll continue going in that order here. So first of all, with fossils, these are examples of whale fossils and also the ancestor of whales, and how their the fossils that they have changed over time and shown how whales would have once lived on land, and then over time they had their population changed and they end up with different structures and their skeletons have changed. So by looking at their fossils, we can see how individuals and therefore populations have changed over many, many years. Vestigial structures are things, it's a remnant of a once useful anatomical structure. Again, crazy words there. Basically what they're saying is that there are structures that living things have that they don't use anymore, but they think might have been useful in the past. And one example here we'll look at is with whales. Whales, if you look here, have this bone. So whales have this bone back here in their pelvis and hind limbs bones, but they don't have hind limbs there. It's something that they would have had when they still lived on land many, many generations ago. But it's there. It hasn't completely gone away yet, but it serves them no purpose. Okay, so here's a better picture showing that. Another example would be that some snakes also have those types of bones. They're very small, but they don't have limbs in the back like they would have predicted to in the past. So these are what are called vestigial structures. The third piece of evidence that we look at is what are called homologous structures. And these are traits that are inherited by two different organisms from a common ancestor. And we're looking for similar patterns across them. So for example, we have a seal flipper and a gray whale flipper, and looking at kind of the similar pattern that we see. We also see this when we look at what are called forelimbs. So for humans, that would be like our arms, but it's just like the front limb. And if we look at many different organisms, we see a similar pattern here. So if we look at turtles and bats and birds and horses and dolphins, we see this similar pattern. We start off with one bone, then two next to each other, then kind of this like wide ones here, and then it kind of breaks apart into different ones. So we have this same pattern, even though clearly they don't look exactly the same. They have changed over time to meet based on what that population was favorable for that population. But there's still the same pattern that we see. And this idea shows us that there is change in the population over time. So these are what are called homologous structures. There's also things called analogous structures. These are things that don't really give us any evidence that populations have changed, but sometimes populations you'll see these, like for example with wings of birds and wings of an insect. They are not related to each other. They don't have the same structure, but they both over time have found that to be a favorable characteristic. Our last term here for today is this concept of what's called artificial selection or selective breeding. It is two terms. They mean the same thing. Artificial selection is kind of like the idea of natural selection, and that populations change over time, except we are looking at humans selecting for it. So it's not nature's being like, hey, this is the most favorable characteristic. It's people saying, hey, we want this characteristic. We're going to breed those ones together. So some examples of that might be, for example, in cows, where we want, if we're looking at dairy cows, we want cows that would produce the most milk. So we would breed the cows that produce the most milk, and over time we would hope that that population would have ones that gave a lot of milk. Or if we wanted a certain type of grass that could grow in different conditions or was a certain color or things like that, we could choose that and breed those over time for that desired trait. This also happens with grapes, apples, all sorts of different things that humans are picking. So this is called artificial selection or selective breeding. We will discuss these terms more in class. Have a good day.